Greetings. We celebrated 150 years of P.E.O. in 2019. And so it was top of mind for me when I began to hear about the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. I wondered about our founders and their position in this, and how that might juxtapose with both the pursuit of suffrage as well as the events in our nation at the time. That was the origin of this program. But what I will share with you today is a high-level timeline interspersed with a few stories to create a picture of the suffrage movement during the time of our founders. The oldest of our founders was born in 1848. Coincidentally, it was that very same year when the women's rights movement organized at the national level at the Seneca Falls Convention. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other participants at this inaugural Women's Rights Convention adopted the Declaration of Sentiments, which called for equality for women and included a resolution that women should seek the right to vote. Now, the suffrage resolution passed by only a narrow margin, and it was helped along by the support of the famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass. He was an early ally of women's rights activists. In fact, women's rights found their start in the abolitionist movement, as most of the initial work that was done was seeking rights for all. We could have a discussion around the partnership with the abolitionists and the disillusion. It would be a large discussion for another day. It's very interesting, though. Here's a bit of information about Mount Pleasant, the home of Iowa Wesleyan and P.E.O. It was a hub of civic activism even this early. During this period of the mid-1800s, various civil rights supporters, including Frederick Douglass, spoke in Mount Pleasant. Now, while I will not be discussing all the elements on the slides, I do encourage you to follow along, as I'll be showing what is going on nationally along the bottom section of the screen to help give perspective on the girls' world as we move through this. For example, Iowa was a very new state at the time the girls were born. In 1859, Iowa Wesleyan became the first college west of the Mississippi to grant a woman a degree. This was during our founders' childhood, and they saw and experienced a lot during this time. The Civil War, slaves were freed, Lincoln was assassinated. In 1866, the American Equal Rights Association was formed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. It was an organization dedicated to the goal of suffrage for all, regardless of gender or race. The organization split within just a couple years due to discourse over whether to focus on the broad issues and a constitutional amendment, or to focus just on gaining suffrage through state constitutions. The takeaway from this is that all the women did not agree on the right way to get to suffrage, nor on how much they should be pursuing in terms of rights. And this ebbed and flowed until we still see it today. Now, two major events occurred in 1869. First, as you know, our 7 founders had the courage to create the P.E.O. organization. Additionally, that year, the Wyoming Territory organized with full suffrage for women. Note, they were just a territory at a time and not a state. In 1870, the year after P.E.O. was founded, Belle Babb Mansfield chaired Iowa's first statewide women's suffrage convention. Belle was an 1866 graduate of Iowa Wesleyan, and she was our founder Alice Byrd's sister-in-law. It was held at Iowa Wesleyan and filled Saunders Hall to its 1,200 person capacity. Belle also served on the board of the National Women's Suffrage Association. This is the statue of Belle that sits on Iowa Wesleyan's campus today. Now, our founders were influenced by the convention, and that same year, Alice Byrd began lecturing on women's suffrage. She later recalled, quote, "We 7 founders received our first lessons in suffrage direction from the mouths of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Anna Dickinson. In our zeal, we had our hair cropped short and made a vow that the tyrant man should never enter our lives. End quote. This is a photo of Mary Allen and Alice Byrd with their short hair, signifying their support. Also in 1870, the first of many anti-suffrage parties was founded. As with any proposed action, there are always those who oppose it. Those members generally included wealthy, influential, primarily Southern women, some Catholic clergymen, distillers and brewers, Southern congressmen, and various corporate capitalists. In 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, granting suffrage to former male African American slaves. And it was this amendment that brought about the break with the abolitionists and their abolitionist allies, such as Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Francis E.W. Walker. This break occurred because when Congress passed the amendment, it explicitly restricted voting rights to males for the first time. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton refused to let their organizations work on the ratification process. Thus, the break with the abolitionists. In 1872, in Rochester, New York, Susan B. Anthony and 14 others were arrested for registering and voting in the presidential election. At Anthony's trial the next year, the judge did not allow her to testify on her own behalf. He dismissed the jury, ruled her guilty, fined her $100. Now, she refused to pay. She wanted to gain more attention by going to jail. However, the fine was paid by a gentleman and she was sent home. In 1877, we lost our first founder, Hattie Briggs, to Chapter Eternal when she was just 27 years old. The very next year, in 1878, a women's suffrage amendment was proposed for the very first time in the US Congress. And this is when the girls are in their mid-20s. Look at all the technology and advancements occurring at this time. Bell Telephone, the electric company, so many changes coming at them. In 1884, the governor of Nebraska appointed founder Frank Rhodes as the first woman commissioner for the state of Nebraska at the New Orleans Exposition and World Fair. During her extensive time at the fair, leading women's activists such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, and others met with the attending women commissioners and expo visitors at least once a week to discuss women's rights. Frank considered these contacts to be a, quote, most potent factor in education, end quote, for her. Upon returning home, Frank worked tirelessly to secure the right for women to hold a seat and vote in the General Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church. It took her 16 years, but she got it accomplished. We lost Alice Coffin to Chapter Eternal in 1888. And at this same time, Coca-Cola is entering into their lives. Our founders are now about 40 years old. And in 1890, our first state chapter was formed in Nebraska. You can follow along with our state P.E.O. chapters as white states are displayed with gold stars on them across the screen. Also in 1890, Wyoming joined the Union with full suffrage for women as granted in their state constitution. This made them the first state in the US where women had full suffrage. And you'll see the states granting women full suffrage building along the top of the screen. In 1893, Colorado became the first state to give women the right to vote through a popular election. This means that the majority of male voters went to the polls and voted to give women the right to vote. Now, interestingly, New Zealand also gave women the right to vote through popular election that same year. And it appears to be just a short difference. And depending on if you look at the date of the election or the date the election results were ratified, one or the other was the first in the world to give women the right to vote through popular election. The next year, during the first statewide election that allowed women to vote in Colorado, 3 women were elected to the Colorado House of Representatives. These were the first women to serve in any state legislature in the US. During the same period, we lost founder Ella Stewart, and we gained 2 more state P.E.O. chapters. 1896 brought 2 more Western states, granting women full suffrage. Also that year, after being pushed out of national suffrage organizations, Black suffragists founded their own groups, including the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was founded by a group of women, including Mary Church Terrell on the left and Ida B. Wells Barnett on the right. They fought hard for the passage of the 19th Amendment. They saw the women's right to vote as a crucial tool to winning legal protections, not only for Black women, but for Black men against the continued repression and violence that they were experiencing. In 1900, at the age of 40, Carrie Chapman Catt took the helm of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Catt is one of the 2 women that really drove this amendment over the finish line. She was a Charles City, Iowa native who had been active in the movement since she was 27 and was mentored by Susan B. Anthony. She actually referred to her as Aunt Susan. Well, we're not going to go into it in any depth. It is of note that these women traveled internationally a great deal. They went back and forth to various women's conferences in Europe to promote the suffrage movement there, while still pushing hard for it in the United States. When our founders are just over 50 years old, we see a whole plethora of state P.E.O. chapters being formed. And our first project came into existence. In 1907, the Educational Loan Fund was established. During this time, our founders saw another Western state grant women suffrage, another president assassinated, and technology continuing to move forward with the Ford Motor Company. In 1912, women's suffrage was supported at the first time at the national level by a major political party, and that was Theodore Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. Also in 1912, 20,000 women marched for suffrage in New York City. 4 more Western states granted women suffrage. 2 more state P.E.O. chapters formed, and the Titanic sinks. In 1913, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, having been inspired by the tactics of Great Britain's more militant suffragists, led a protest march of women in Washington, D.C. on the day of Woodrow Wilson's first inauguration. Alice Paul is the other woman key, along with Carrie Chapman Catt, to moving the amendment across the finish line. Now in the bottom picture, bottom right, you can see the front of the march, and it quickly turned into what you see in the top 2 pictures. The police did not hold the crowd back. Some of the women were attacked and dragged out. They did reach their goal. It took them an extra 2 hours, but they did get to where they were going with their march. Now, over the next 2 years, we see more Western women granted suffrage, and New York continuing to push hard for suffrage with larger and more frequent parades. And we see 2 more state P.E.O. chapters formed. In 1916, Jeanette Rankin of Montana becomes the first woman elected to the United States House of Representatives. Rankin was involved in the suffrage movement, having organized the New York Women's Suffrage Party, as well as having served as president of the Montana Women's Suffrage Association. The day after Wilson's second inauguration in early 1917, National Women's Party picketers appeared in front of the White House holding 2 banners. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? And Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? These women were referred to as the Silent Sentinels. They surrounded the White House and stood silently in all weather with their signs in protest. They were there to remind Wilson of his silence and lack of support for women's suffrage. Now, if you visit the White House today, you will always find picketers, lots of them. But it's interesting to note that the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, was the first organization to ever picket the White House. By June, Wilson was tired of seeing them every time he drove out, and arrests of the picketers began. They were charged with obstructing sidewalk traffic. The picketers were sentenced to up to 6 months in jail. The women would go on hunger strikes to raise awareness, and forced feedings were employed against them frequently. For some, the feedings were done in such a violent manner they caused permanent damage to the women's digestive systems. You can see a picture demonstrating that in the upper right. A picture of Alice Paul is in the lower left. In November of that year, the government unconditionally released the picketers in response to public outcry and their inability to stop the picketers' hunger strikes. The Silent Sentinels picketed for a total of 2.5 years until the amendment was passed. Approximately 2,000 women took their turns standing around the White House with the signs. They were harassed, arrested, unjustly treated by both local and federal authorities. In total, nearly 500 women were arrested and 168 served jail time. In 1917, the year the US entered World War I, we saw the first Eastern state, New York, grant women's suffrage, and 2 more P.E.O. state chapters were formed. In 1918, when our 4 remaining founders were about 70 years of age, 3 more Western states granted women full suffrage, and Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana opened debate on a suffrage amendment in the House. The amendment passed the House, but failed to win the required 2/3 majority needed in the Senate. In total, the House and the Senate voted on the federal suffrage amendment 5 times before it passed in June of 1919, and the ratification process could begin. Representative Rankin was no longer in office when it passed, but late in her life, she was quoted as saying, quote, "If I am remembered for no other act, I want to be remembered as the only woman who ever voted to give women the right to vote." And all this is happening while battling a flu pandemic and wearing masks. In the 2-year pandemic, approximately 675,000 US deaths occurred. At the time the amendment was passed by Congress, you can see where we stood nationally in terms of suffrage for women on this map. Except for Michigan and New York, the 19 states shown in dark blue that had granted suffrage were in the West. And the 7 states in red that allowed no suffrage for women were in the south and eastern portion of the country. Many of the states allowed a combination with something of school and municipal board opportunities to vote. On the international front, many major countries were ahead of the US in granting full suffrage for women. Now you can see on here, it looks like the end of the World War I seemed to be the turning point for many, but all of these countries gave women full suffrage before we did in the United States. By March of 1920, a total of 35 states had approved the amendment, just shy of the 3/4 required for ratification. 8 states had rejected the amendment. 5 had not voted. Suffragists saw Tennessee as the last best hope to pass the amendment and get ratification before the 1920 presidential election. So the summer of 1920 was one of intense pro and anti-suffrage activity in Nashville. Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul's organizations were out in force, as were the anti-suffragists. In August, the voting began, and over multiple days of voting, debating, argument, and political persuasion, The vote remained tied. Now, prior to the voting beginning, 25-year-old Harry Byrne had originally intended to vote for the amendment. However, after being pressured by party leaders and receiving misleading telegrams from his home constituents telling him that his district was overwhelmingly opposed to women's suffrage, he began to side with the antis, and he had voted no throughout the multiple votes. On August 18th, the House Speaker called for another vote. This time, Harry voted aye. His vote broke the tie in favor of ratifying the amendment. Following the vote, he had to respond to attacks on his integrity and honor, including being accused of bribery and having a grand jury called to investigate it. However, he explained his decision to cast the vote in part because, quote, "I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification," end quote. The morning of the vote, in his pocket was a wire that read from his mother that read in part, quote, "I've been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." When the 19th Amendment was passed, it was worded the same as the amendment proposed in 1878, 41 years earlier. Not one word was changed. It simply reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." So it's important to note that while we regularly state women got the right to vote in 1920, it was just really full protection for white women. Native American women did not receive full voting rights for 42 more years until 1962, and African American women did not get full voting rights until 45 years later in 1965. And that was with the Voting Rights Act. They'd been held back because of various Jim Crow laws and other acts of voter suppression. While 4 of our founders were still alive when the 19th Amendment was ratified, only 3, Frank Rhodes, Mary Allen, and Alice Byrd, were alive for the presidential election that fall, the first where women had been granted full suffrage across the US. Interestingly, while it is believed that all 7 of our founders supported suffrage, the 3 that lived to see full suffrage were those that I have documented stories about relating to the movement. Later that year, Carrie Chapman Catt formed the League of Women Voters. 3 years later, on the 75th anniversary of the Seneca Falls Convention, Alice Paul proposed an equal rights amendment to remedy the inequities not addressed in the 19th. And this is all happening about the same time the NFL and Walt Disney are coming into being. We saw more state P.E.O. chapters forming and the passing of our last founders over the following years. At the 1922 Illinois State Convention of P.E.O., State President Helen Harlan made the following comments, quote, "If a woman regards the 19th Amendment merely as the right to vote, she may as well stay at home on election day, as many ill-equipped men do. But the enfranchisement of women means vastly more than that. It means that women are eligible to any office in the United States, that there is no part in the different classifications of our government that they may not play. They may enter our judiciary, they may participate in our legislative bodies, may be the executive heads of our cities, our states, and yes, even of the nation. There is no door now closed to women, politically or governmentally. She has become, at least potentially, a dominating force." Our founders lived through quite a time in history. 2 major wars, 2 presidents assassinated, a major pandemic, the boom of technology advancement, and the entire national women's suffrage movement. The role of women evolved during their lifetimes, and they were certainly a part of that evolution. They created the organization that we're all a part of today and helping raise women up. Thank you. These are the recommended books that I have. You'll find those listed on the website also.